Hi, welcome to my first attempted Zoom lecture that I'm preparing for the next semester. My name is Professor Andrew Gardner. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. And as you can see from the title slide of our lecture for today, the presentation today is entitled Imperial Diversity and an articulation of the concept of a social prism. So I sort of have two different purposes that I'm pursuing with this presentation. Um, I typically ask my students to have read two articles prior to arriving at this lecture, although there's going to be a much longer list of articles that you'll find in the last slide of the presentation for today. But one of them that I think is a great preface to this presentation is Omar al-Shahabi's paper, Contested Modernity, Divided Rule and the Birth of Sectarianism, Nationalism, and Absolutism in Bahrain. And the second one is the McKeerchern article that's also listed on the last slide called about the concept of race in anthropology. Now, I should also note that this presentation is based on a paper that I published in the fall of 2019 called Imperial Diversity, and you can find that on the internet. It's published at a digital magazine called Area Magazine. If the ideas that I discuss here pique your interest, you might consider having a look at the longer article. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to avoid slides that are just text bombs, essentially, but I did want to start with this one, okay? And this is the abstract for the paper that I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. And so the abstract reads, the concepts of diversity and inclusion have great cultural power in American society right now. Among those concepts' proponents, however, there is a failure to recognize them as part of a paradigm indelibly intertwined with American culture and history. While many academics have been longstanding critics of American imperialism, both past and present, many contemporary anthropologists fail to recognize the imperial footprint of the ideas and values that course through that paradigm's uniquely American premises. This essay examines the historical source of this diversity paradigm and seeks to describe its imperialist practices, specifically through an analysis of the export of the social prism that distills these premises to the wealthy Arab state of Qatar and the narratives woven into its new slavery museum. So that abstract is my attempt to sort of convey the entire arc of this paper. But to start with, and the story that I want to tell is going to begin in Bahrain. So this is an early color photograph of Manama, the main port and transnational entrepot in the broader Indian Ocean world. The Kingdom of Bahrain is a collection of islands just off the eastern coastline of Saudi Arabia. And for much of the 20th century, Bahrain wasn't a colony, a British colony, but rather a British protectorate. And that's actually going to be an important element of the story that I'm trying to tell. But here's one of the photographs that I really like. I think this photograph, at least in my mind, kind of conveys the sort of busy transnational port that was at play really for thousands of years in Bahrain. On this next photograph, you can see this is Sheikh Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, who ruled the kingdom between 1942 and 1961. And this was the British advisor Charles Belgrave, who's also well known. And there's a couple other photographs of the two of them and some others that you can see here, sometime in that window between 42 and 61, administering the kingdom, the Protectorate. And here's the Sheikh Salman again, and Belgrave, obviously on a boat. So let me turn briefly to a little bit of history about Bahrain. So the interesting thing about Bahrain, and I should note that I'm an anthropologist. I conducted my dissertation fieldwork in Bahrain. But if we look deep into the history of Bahrain, and it has a very, very deep history, it was tossed between various empires for much of its existence. The Persians, the Omanis, the Portuguese, the Ottomans, all were sort of vying for control of these islands at various times in the last 3 or 4 centuries. In 1868, an agreement was reached by recognizing the Al Khalifa family as the island's ruling family. The fledgling nation would become a British protectorate. So that was the agreement that was reached in 1868. And interestingly, the status of a protectorate established what's called co-sovereignty. The British would manage foreign affairs and jurisdiction over foreigners on the island, while the Bahrainis would retain jurisdiction over its citizenry. In essence, the protectorate kind of created a dual bureaucracy and a dual system of law. So for thousands of years, as I've already noted, these islands were a busy sort of crossroads or juncture in what some academics call the greater Indian Ocean world. All sorts of people from Asia, Africa, Europe, other parts of the Middle East had been present and were present on these islands and had been there for a long, long time. With this dual system of law that the British protectorate sought to establish, there were some obvious and important questions that needed to be addressed. Who of the residents on the island were the citizens, and who were the foreigners? And therefore, which set of laws applied to which people? So it was perhaps, I don't know, 60 years before this photograph was taken that the British endeavored to answer that question. And to grapple with this question, they needed to gather information about who resided on the islands. And to do that, they relied on colonial agents, missionaries, merchants, and a miscellany of others whose information was intended to help the administration understand this resident population and therefore to decide which laws applied to whom. As Bahraini scholar Omar al-Shahabi contends, the categories and labels established by the British emphasized the sectarian differences in the Muslim population on the islands. Central to the British understanding of the resident population was the Shia and Sunni bifurcation. Atop that primary sectarian division that was established as the British were sort of trying to figure out who all these people are and to categorize them, atop that central bifurcation, the British also delineated a variety of other geographical, regional, and sub-ethnic differentiations that helped them conceptually organize this population. So the set of categories and labels by which the British sought to comprehend and organize the diversity of peoples resident on these islands in the Persian Gulf are what I mean by a social prism. This understanding is one example of what I mean by a social prism, and I'm going to return to that topic shortly. So this is a photograph that I pulled from the internet, and I want to note al-Shahabi further contends in his analysis of what was happening amongst the British colonial sort of protectorate regime 100 years ago, 120 years ago in Bahrain. He contends that the British colonial, what he calls ethno-sectarian gaze, was largely oblivious to the social fabric that had preceded the British arrival, and that the resulting imposition of that colonial gaze with sect as its primary bifurcation, that gaze extinguished various solidarities that traversed these cleavages and differences. More profoundly, and here I want to quote Al-Shahabi, the epistemic units for analyzing local actors, purveyed by the British and calcified in policy a century ago, remain the fundamental units by which the Bahraini population is comprehended by outsiders and by which the Bahrainis themselves understand each other and how they fit together in society. So most of those words are mine, but the few that I started with were Omar al-Shahabi's words. But the point that he's making is a point that I want to hang on to, that these categories and divisions that the British Protectorate established over 100 years ago to build this protectorate system, the way that it organized the diversity of peoples present on the island, remain the categories by which the Bahrainis think of themselves and by which outsiders think of Bahrainis even today. And that was never more apparent than it was in 2011 when the Arab Spring wreaked havoc on sort of any social tranquility that had been previously present on the islands. The Shia majority, the oppressed Shia majority, arose against and chafed against the sort of power of the Sunni ruling class. So some of you might recognize this image from the cover of my favorite, one of my favorite albums. So on this next set of slides, though, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the concept of a social prism and its definition. And so here's a start. Much as a prism takes a singular emanation of light and divides it into its components, into separate components, a social prism takes the human singularity, our universal humanism, and subdivides it into conceptual groups and categories. Those categories organize our society, and more fundamentally, they organize the way that we think about each other. So anthropologists have long been fascinated by the diverse groupings humans have established. In the ethnographic canon accumulated over nearly 2 centuries, anthropologists have described castes, classes, age sets, moieties, clans, tribes, ethnic groups, religious sects, genders, and more. So what I mean by a social prism is a paradigm or a discourse, an ideology, a collective understanding, a framework of sorts, but one with a history, something that changes and evolves over time, and something with a historical context in which it was produced. It is essentially a system for subdividing the continuum of human difference into categories. And so here on this slide, I've taken sort of color and as an analogy sort of offered these subdivisions, these categories of color names that we've applied to this continuum of difference in color. So one of the ways that some humans subdivide and categorize the continuum of human difference is with the concept of race. And so this slide is a slide that I developed last year for my course at the University of Puget Sound, Introduction to Anthropology. And this slide was inspired by a sentence in the Scott McKeerchern reading that I've listed at the end of this presentation. It's a reading about race, the concept of race in anthropology. And in that article, he notes that if a person could walk from Lagos to Stockholm or Bangkok, and I'm quoting him here, they would see a progressively shifting spectrum of physical differences, physical characteristics, reflecting the constant interactions between neighboring communities through many thousands of years. And so I began to think about how might our concept of race be jostled or shaken or altered if we too were to walk the distances that we typically fly, for example. And so on that note, I put together this transect from Amsterdam to, where is that? In Vietnam, I think just Vietnam. So drew a transect from the Netherlands to Vietnam, and then just went on the internet and just clipped pictures of people that I could find along the way to try to replicate this more gradual sort of walking, as McCutcheon suggested. And so I want to carry you through that experience as well on this slide. So like the continuum of color that I showed you on the last slide, it gets categorized into what we think of as green and yellow and red and blue. A social prism is a way that we take the continuum of human difference and diversity and organize it into groups. And I think McCutcheon has a point that if we were to walk this transect rather than fly, those like the arbitrary places that in our minds we've conceptually drawn those lines would become much less clear to us. For example, looking at this picture, the question would be, where do you draw the line between white and non-white, or where do you draw the line between European and Asian, or something like that? Those conceptual categories become much more difficult to draw. And so I think um, this helps us sort of more clearly visualize the continuum of human variability and how a social prism, and the social prism of race, categorizes and subdivides that variability. So this helps us, I think, get to what I want to talk about on this slide, which are some of the key properties of what I'm calling a social prism. A social prism is something that's socially constructed. It subdivides our universal humanism. Think, for example, of the biologically untenable nature of race that anthropology long established, right? For a century, anthropology has been clear that there is no biology to race. And so but it's a social construction, and a very meaningful social construction. But I want to hang on to the fact that race is a social construction. In addition, a social prism is something that differs between cultures. So for example, the social prism that we started with, our discussion with today, Bahrain, right, emphasizes sectarian differences between the Shia and Sunni residents of Bahrain. That's a different sort of social prism than the United States may have, or Japan may have. These social prisms, how we divide up humanity, changes between different cultures and different traditions, and actually also changes over time, even in the same place like the United States, as we'll see shortly. Social prisms are also inherited, right? Oftentimes inherited from the past. In that sense, a social prism is really a significant portion of what anthropologists refer to as culture. And then, as the Bahraini example shows us, a social prism can also be something that's a product of interaction and indeed domination by cultural outsiders. And when I'm thinking about this idea, I also oftentimes my mind carries me to the Rwanda and the Hutu Tutsi division, which was very much a sort of reverberation that was also implanted by the colonial presence there long ago, and eventually percolated into the terrible civil war of more recent times. So in summary, social prism can endure over centuries and can calcify over time. So before we continue, I've already sort of talked a little bit about the social prism that the British Protectorate established in Bahrain, but I thought it might also be more illuminating for me to briefly talk about a pre-modern social prism in Arabia. And so the segmentary lineage system that's a term that anthropologists use to talk about the nature of tribal organization, social organization, one of the predominant forms of social organization that predated the contemporary era on the Arabian Peninsula, and not just Bahrain. So there's this ancient saying, it's a proverb, a Bedouin proverb of sorts: I against my brother, my brothers and me against our cousins, my cousins and me against the world. And so just to translate that, I against my brother on this sort of kinship chart would mean that A and B, brothers, let's imagine, might have a disagreement, a fight. They might be physically fighting with each other. But should a disagreement arise between, let's say, A and C, his cousin, then even though the brothers A and B on this diagram were previously fighting, when it comes to this fight with their cousin, they are inevitably a team, right? They stand together against their cousin. But then should someone from beyond that, and let's say just someone H from out, the world, have a disagreement with A again, who I guess A is a very disagreeable sort of person, but nonetheless, then cousins are united with brothers against the person H, who's distant, familially distant. And so that's all sort of encapsulated in this traditional Bedouin proverb. And I think that proverb really captures the essence of the segmentary lineage system. Now on this next slide, this is a slide that I developed long ago for a class that I was teaching on the women's campus in Qatar, and we had a great conversation about this class. But if you sort of transpose that idea and sort of think of it as a social prism, how does it organize all of the people that one might encounter out there in the world? Well, this is what I came up with ego at the center, and then family, and then clan, which is a group of families of the same lineage, and then tribe, sort of the largest sort of unit of lineage, right? And then Bedouin, so that Bedu as a system of interrelated, or maybe not related, but tribes. And then Bedouin sort of after that, the next valence would be Muslims, and then people of the book, that would be non-Muslims, Christians and Jews, and then non-believers sort of beyond that. And so this is a different sort of social prism, and very much a hypothetical or theoretical one based on this segmentary lineage system. But nonetheless, it gives you another sort of glimpse of the fact that there are different ways of organizing and comprehending and conceptualizing the diversity of peoples that we might encounter in the world. And this is another example of what I mean by a social prism. So next I want to turn to an examination of how I see the contemporary American social prism. But first, I want to lodge a pair of issues in your mind to explore or to think about as we explore what I see as the American understanding, contemporary American understanding of human difference. I think we might establish the important difference between those who fight against the categories established by a dominant social prism versus those who utilize and fight with the categories established by a social prism. And so I just want to keep that difference in mind. And then also, I think that we might remain attentive not just to who purportedly benefits from a given social prism, but also who relies on a particular understanding that's established by a social prism, who benefits from that social prism, and whose reason for existence would vanish under a different understanding. So, for example, just moving back to the example of Bahrain, that sectarian difference that was established by the British Protectorate social prism 100 years ago very much sort of is to the benefit of the Sunni leadership today and to the detriment of the Shia majority on the islands. And I urge you think similarly about the U.S. Who benefits from this way of organizing human difference, the way of organizing human difference that I want to get to and discuss here. Okay, so on to our exploration of the American social prism. And I actually want to start here with this map. And this map was published in 1943, and I found it at an estate sale. I love to go on the weekends to estate sales, although that's been significantly impaired by the pandemic. But I love going to estate sales when possible here in Tacoma, Washington. And this map was entitled Makers of the USA. It was designed and drawn by Louise E. Jefferson, super interesting woman with an interesting story. And she was the artistic director at Friendship Press in New York City as well. And so I think, remember, here we are in 1943. I want to take a closer look at how difference is organized and presented on this map from the middle of the 20th century. Perhaps you can see the writing along the outer edges of the map, but here's what's printed on. I'll just read the right edge of the map. It's Filipinos, Mexicans, Slavs, Danes, Spaniards, Negroes, Japanese, Syrians, and Swiss. Now, on this next slide, I've brought us to a close-up of the Southeast and can give you a little bit more of the flavor of this map and how it thinks about and organizes difference. Here you can see a mix of different ethnic groups, and also I think drawings that sort of indicate some of the economic activities that are presented and oftentimes associated with these particular groups. I mean, remember the theme of this map is makers of the USA. And so what do we have here? We have Negroes again in the Southeast, but then also the Seminoles and the French and the Greeks, the Syrians, Scott-Irish, and then a couple other things on this map. I also wanted to look at the Northwest where I live, my home. And so here in the West generally, you can see, well, I noticed immediately that the Chinese were mentioned twice, but up in my neck of the woods, Scandinavians, Finns, and then the Blackfoot Native Americans out well east of the mountains as well. So I think we can at least perceive the outlines of a social prism here as well. One that is very much linked to ancestry, and one that very much emphasizes migration and the migrant presence in America as well, despite, of course, the presence of many Native Americans on this map as well, people who were here before the migrations that I'm talking about. Now, I want to compare that 1943 presentation of America with this word cloud. So this is the operational social prism that I encountered this year in the form of a survey questionnaire sent to me from my daughter's school. The questionnaire is the product of Washington State's Race and Ethnicity Student Data Task Force. And this word cloud that I generated presents the entirety of the options from which one might choose. There are, for example, 99 choices that are classified as Black, although that actually includes all Latino Americans or Hispanic Americans for reasons that I won't go into here. There are 36 choices classified as white, 37 choices classified as Native American, 26 choices for Asian, and 21 choices that are classified as Pacific Islander. So to illuminate this a bit more, let me read from the choices from which we had to choose, my daughter, in the category of white. So on this 2020 questionnaire, the category of white included these options: white, Bosnian, Herzegovinian, Polish, Romanian, Russian, Ukrainian, Algerian, Amazigh or Berber, that was one choice, Arab, Assyrian, Bahraini, Bedouin, Chaldean, Copt, Druze, Egyptian, Emirati, Iranian, Iraqi, Israeli, Jordanian, Kurdish, Kuwaiti, which was inexplicably also only one category, Lebanese, Libyan, Moroccan, Omani, Palestinian, Qatari, Saudi Arabian, Syrian, Tunisian, and Yemeni. So those were the choices that my daughter and I were faced with as well. So while my emphasis with Bahrain early in this presentation was on the stability and the enduring nature of the social prism that was conferred there by the British Protectorate more than a century ago, the 70 plus years between these two American examples suggests more continuity and change. So in terms of the continuity, I would argue that race and ethnicity remain central to the American social prism between both the map that I showed and the questionnaire that we're talking about now. And I think that also you can kind of see this idea of America as an integrative national container, right? That can be, or ideally will be, amenable to cultural difference. So this idea of all this difference sort of mixing together in this national container is a thread that I think we can kind of perceive throughout these two examples of the American social prism that are 60, 70 years apart. However, I also think there are some noteworthy changes in the social prism, the American social prism. And I think a lot of those changes, if you think back to those categories that I just read, has to do with the consolidation of European whiteness and shifting whiteness from a kind of ethnic conceptualization of whiteness to a racial conceptualization of whiteness. And then also, interestingly, the expansion of Blackness, where all Black Americans on the map from 1943 were figured or presented as Negroes, using that now antiquated and problematic term, I suppose. Nowadays, that category of Blackness has been vastly expanded. And also on this questionnaire, there's also the loss of geographical and regional associations, I think, in this era of mobility. And really, I think also another change is in the questionnaire, you can really see an emphasis on the elective sort of aspects of identity, like what will you choose, and many choices to choose from. So I guess that sort of gives you some overview of my thinking about the contemporary American social prism. So on this next slide, I want to assert that college campuses, like the one that employs me, are actually the epicenter in the manufacture of this American diversity paradigm. So I argue that on thousands of campuses, like the University of Puget Sound, students away from home for the first time, typically, are immersed in classrooms where this paradigm, this social prism, is broadcasted and considered and constructed and discussed and elaborated and extended. This paradigm is in the air that we breathe on campus. And so I've put some images of some of the posters that I just have collected from the hallways in my campus as examples. And these posters all in some way or another kind of indicate this. Activities, funding, majors, social activities, and coursework are all built around this diversity, what I call the diversity paradigm. And so universities like ours manufacture, normalize, and disseminate this American diversity paradigm, what I'm calling our social prism. The way that we take that that variance, the human variability and difference, and categorize it and organize it. So briefly, on this next slide, I want to convey the assertion that I see campuses as places that are very much involved in producing and disseminating this social prism. Joel Kotkin uses the term clericy to describe the class of wealthy Americans who serve the needs of the 1%, the billionaire class. The power, as he says, the power of the clericy stems primarily not from money or the control of technology, but from persuading, instructing, and regulating the rest of society. This has particular impact given that the vast majority of the clericy are increasingly uniform in their worldview. And then continuing, he says, although some of this new priestly class are directly tied to the tech oligarchy, others inhabit the realms of governmental institutions, universities, the mainstream media, law firms, and major foundations. And so this is my world, right? I live and work in a university. My students, many of them are headed precisely to these kinds of jobs in what Joel Kotkin calls the clericy, a new sort of element of the class structure that he sees in contemporary America. And to me, this clericy that he describes also very much defines what many of us are now calling the bubble that we live in on working on a campus like mine. And so evidence, I think, of this existence of this clericy, or at least this bubble, are evident in a couple places. And I want to talk about two examples that I think very much illuminate the presence of this cultural bubble around what he calls the clericy. And so I'm going to talk about Dave Chappelle, his special Sticks and Stones, and its reviews on Rotten Tomato, and then I'll turn to Latinx briefly as well. So with Dave Chappelle, we'll start with this example in his Netflix comedy special. Critics, and that's from the media, and hence part of what Joel Kotkin calls the clericy, initially gave his special a 0% approval rating. And so here's a screenshot from that when five of the anointed experts, anointed by Rotten Tomatoes, had entered their evaluations of his special and gave it a 0% rating. And at this time, the audience was not yet available to the audience, and so hence there were no audience ratings. Then several days later, maybe a week later, it was open to the audience, and look at what happened here. So 17 of these media film reviewers by that time had reviewed it, and its estimation rose from 0% to 35% approval rating. But then 40,659 members of the audience had given it a total rating of 99%. And so it's that discrepancy, right, between members of what Joel Kotkin would call the clerisy, members of our campus bubble and the media, evaluating something like Dave Chappelle's Sticks and Stones versus the audience achieving a 99% approval rating, I think very much kind of speaks to the fact that there are significant differences in the perspectives, opinions, values between much of America and what's happening in the bubble of this clerisy, as Joel Kotkin calls it. Let's look at another example as well. And this involves the term Latinx, which is certainly familiar to any of us who live, work, and dwell inside the bubble of the clerisy, and is probably something that is more and more familiar to all Americans as well, considering our media. In late 2019, a progressive pollster and market researcher, Mario Carrasco, conducted a survey to ascertain the popularity of the term Latinx among America's 52 million people of Latin American ancestry. And so his sample included 508 respondents, and here you can see are his data. And really, I'm going to read his key finding. Only 2% of our respondents said the label Latinx accurately describes them, making it the least popular ethnic label among Latinos. So again, what I'm trying to point to here is that there are such significant differences between what's happening within this campus bubble, this bubble of the clerisy, and the rest of America. And the social prism that I'm also describing here, and that I think is hegemonic today, is very much being conjured and erected and polished within the boundaries of the bubble of this clerisy. So on this next slide, I want to turn quickly, although there's a lot of to think about here, I think, to what I also want to point to as the uniquely American premises of this social prism, the uniquely American conditions in which this paradigm was produced. Basically, what I'm trying to argue on this slide is that this social prism is very much a product of the American context, inextricably tied to our nation's history, specific to that context. And I think that that tether is visible in 5 different areas. First, I think the centrality of ethnicity to the social prism by which we Americans organize the diversity of humankind and understand one another. The centrality of ethnicity is a testament to its American pedigree. We are a nation of migrants, mostly, right? And it's through that particular history and particular context of all kinds of different people from all kinds of different places that this emphasis on ethnicity became it was something we could see even in the map from 1943. Second of all, I think the constitutional democracy on which these relations and this social prism was articulated is also a testament to its American pedigree. Third, I think that the assimilationist philosophy at the core of the identitarian aspiration for inclusion, and we hear a lot about inclusion, that inclusion in my mind points back to this desire for assimilation, right, and integration. And again, that also feels very much like an American sort of issue, right? Those are not the way that we would describe the social prism by which the Qatar, the Arabs in Qatar think about the foreigners in their presence. Fourth, I think the centrality of Blackness to the American diversity paradigm is also very much connected to American history and marks this social prism that I'm calling the diversity paradigm, marks it as something that is very much an American understanding and an American social prism. Fifth and finally, the individualism around which the social prism is built, I think, is also very much a testament to its American pedigree. Rights, belonging, and identity are all conceived as properties that belong to the individual, that cohere to the individual. And there again, I think that speaks to its American pedigree. So in these concluding slides, I want to turn to the assertion at the core of the title of this presentation, that this American social prism that I've tried to describe in this presentation is being exported and imperially imposed on the remnants of diversity of other peoples and social traditions that we can still see in this world. And to do so, we're going to move 60 miles to the south, to the Kingdom of Bahrain, from the Kingdom of Bahrain to Qatar, and consider the Bin Jalmoud House, or what's commonly known as Qatar's new slavery museum. This museum, which is pictured here, is undoubtedly a stunning and captivating museum, truly impressive and impactful experience for the visitor, and I've visited many, many times. More than a decade ago, Sheikha Moza, the powerful second wife of the former emir, commissioned the museum. A host of cosmopolitan experts were hired to help realize this vision. And for a brief time, I worked as a paid consultant to the museum. And during that stint, I worked with one North American director who conveyed to me how the museum would, quote, confront Qataris with the reality of their own social history. And those words, his words, they really stuck with me. Confronting the Qataris with their history, that idea for this museum, that impetus behind the museum really did stick with me over the years. As an ethnographer, anthropologist, in assessing the plans for the museum that I was presented with, I interviewed many of my Qatari friends about the idea of this forthcoming museum. One posed to me the rhetorical question, what would Qatar gain from sending its school children to this museum and thereby teaching them that the darker-skinned Qatari citizens, members of their tribes, clans, and families now, are to be conceptually differentiated from other citizens by their distant ancestry. This was what one of my Qatari friends conveyed to me. And so I suggest that the identification of some of Qatar's former slaves and their descendants, identifying them as a discrete social category, as a particular type of Qatari citizen, and a type that can and should coalesce into an ethnic socio-political movement. I think this can be understood as the imposition of a Western American-made social prism. And so I pulled this piece of clip art off of the internet. And just as an example though, as this American, my argument is that this American social prism, focused as it is on racial and ethnic difference, rooted in sort of Blackness and very much tied to American history in that sense, takes these Qataris, these four Qatari youth, and basically imposes the idea, an American idea of difference upon these young men, telling one of these young men, I suppose, that he's different from the others. And that's the essence of the kind of imperialism that I see with the imposition of this social prism. So this museum changed the focus on who Qatar's former slaves were as well. It actually, in sort of imposing this American social prism, right, actually excluded others. And that's visible in this map that I took from that slavery museum about the historical sources of Qatar's slaves. As you can see, some of those slaves came from the Horn of Africa, but other slaves came from what's called Baluchistan, and that's the area of sort of Iran, Pakistan, and where the Baluchi people live. And many of the slaves that were brought to Arabia, not just Qatar, but Arabia, came from Baluchistan. But this American social prism orients the idea of slavery away from the Baluchi history and towards this African emphasis on slavery as well. And so it also, this social prism, this American social prism that I refer to as the diversity paradigm, it pulls Blackness from its indigenous articulation in the families, clans, and tribes by which much of Qatari society is organized, and connects that newly conceptualized portion of the Qatari citizenry with an Atlantic Blackness that's inextricably entwined with settler societies and with slavery in the New World. All right, in these last slides, I want to present some concluding thoughts. Like modernization theory in the 1960s, and then like neoliberalism in the late 1980s and certainly in the 1990s, this social prism, what I call the diversity paradigm that I've been describing here, is being cultivated and disseminated through the American-dominated global system of higher education. I think of universities as the last remaining viable tools of American imperialism. Although anthropologists and other academics have long been attuned to American imperialism, they seem unable to grasp this cultural imperialism. Why is that? And this is a puzzle that I spend time thinking about. Perhaps because the values of the diversity paradigm align too closely with their own values. Maybe they can't see it at all. Maybe that's a testament to the power of what anthropologists call ethnocentricity, right? Sometimes our own culture is the hardest one for us to see and understand. In rejecting cultural difference unaligned with its key values, however, the diversity paradigm and those who promulgate it extinguish or help extinguish the remnants of cultural diversity that have somehow persevered in the roiling interrelations of the 20th century. So, and I can also end with a couple quotes here. This is from the McKeachern reading that I've listed on the last slide. He says that American definition, and he said this in 2012, American definitions and American relations of race are not necessarily universal, although the power of the United States today means that social and cultural debates about race around the world are increasingly debated using American meanings. That, very much captures my point, I think, with this reading. But then I also wanted to make sure I got Zizek's quote up here. What if the way that we perceive a problem is already part of the problem? And I think this is also an element of what's happening here. In the way that we are comprehending the problems and frictions around the world, it's actually in the way we're conceptualizing the problem that the problem itself hides. And then I put up a final slide here. What do we do with all of this information? I think the academy needs to much more strongly encourage a heterodox environment, to be much more sensitive to the depth of cultural difference still present in this world, and to model for all of society what tolerance and civility ought to look like. We must learn to live and collaborate with people who are committed to values and prospects different from those we hold, and we hold dear many times. To be clear, I'm talking to myself in some ways in saying this, certainly, but I'm also talking to you who made it to the end of this presentation. On this last slide, I have some of the readings that I thought were pretty integral to the presentation that I've had here. I certainly appreciate your long attention. That was an hour-long presentation, very, very, very long. I'm going to cease the recording, and we can absolutely move towards a conversation, those of you who are actually present here watching this. For the rest of you, and anyone watching this at a later date, I'd welcome any comments, reflections, or critiques via email. My contact information is easy enough to find. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.